there, Toony here from SEWnergy. Thank you for joining me. Another holiday season is upon us, and guess what I've been making a lot this year? Ta-da! Pot holders! I've been making pot holders for my friends and neighbors in the past couple of days, so I thought I should make a video of myself making one. Now, there are tons and tons of sewing tutorial videos for pot holders on the internet, and this version is not that special, to be honest. In fact, I have combined different styles from various sources and kind of made it my own version. I will link to the videos that inspired this project in the description box in case you would like to check them out. Having said that, I really enjoyed making these pot holders, and I would like to share my style with you as well. There's really nothing much to this project. It's small, it's scrappy, you're gonna have a lot of fun making it. Let's get started! Since we're making a scrappy pot holder, it's time to get out your scraps. I've got a whole bunch of strips here. I've got 2.5 inch, 2 inch, and 1.5 inch strips. And I'm going to use these on the front of my pot holder. Just to show you how the different widths of strips affect the look of your pot holder, on the left one I use 2 inch strips, and on the right one I use 1.5 inch strips. On the back side of your pot holder, you're going to need one piece of fabric that is about 11 by 11 inches, and my fabric is quite wrinkled. Alternatively, you can sew smaller scrap fabrics together or sew your strips together to make an 11 by 11 piece of fabric. For the binding, you're going to need a strip of fabric that is 2.25 inches wide by width of fabric, which is about 42 to 44 inches. This is important because you want the binding to go around the perimeter of your pot holder and have some fabric left. I happen to have some leftover binding from my previous quilting project, so I'm going to use that. To make my pot holder easier to store, I'm going to add a tab and a button. So the tab is 2 inches by 6.5 inches. And my button has the diameter of 5/8 of an inch. These are optional, but they add a nice touch to the pot holder. Now we're going to move on to batting. I'm using 2 kinds of batting for this project. The first kind is your regular cotton batting. I have 2 scrap pieces of batting right here, and I'm going to go to my sewing machine and zigzag them together. Here's how the batting looks after the 2 small pieces have been stitched together with a zigzag stitch. The other kind of batting that I'm using for my pot holder is called Insul-Bright, and this is by the Warm Company. It is an insulated polyester batting that is commonly used in heat-resistant products. Some of the tools that you're going to need for this project include your cutting mat, your ruler, your rotary cutter, scissors. I am using quilting needles. In this pack there are 2 sizes, 75/11 and 90/14. You might need the bigger needle for when you attach binding because it gets a little thick. For the thread, I'm just using regular polyester thread. This is Aerofil Madeira, and I try to have my hump jumper on hand in case I need it. The next tool is not mandatory but is really nice to have. It's a stiletto, and you're probably going to need some sewing clips or pins. Here are some presser feet that will be helpful in your sewing. First, you're going to need your regular zigzag foot. This next foot is a button sewing foot. It came with my machine, so I'm going to use this to sew the button. You can also sew your button on by hand. The next foot is my machine's version of a walking foot. I think Toony calls this an even feed foot. And what's cool about this foot is that the foot part can be taken off and you can put different feet on the attachment. So right now I have my stitch in the ditch foot, and also I have my 1/4 inch foot that works with the even feet system. I also have another regular 1/4 inch foot. These feet are what I'm going to use, but you can sew this pot holder entirely with your zigzag foot. First, I'm going to trim my cotton batting to an 11 by 11 inch square. And you don't have to be exact or anything, just make it around that size. The next step is the most fun part, I think. So you're gonna pick your strips. You could go with one size. I'm just gonna go random on this one. I'm just gonna pick whatever works. And I'm gonna pick my centerpiece that goes diagonally across the pot holder. And you can see here, I don't have a piece that is long enough, so I'm gonna stitch two smaller strips together and make one long strip. See you at the sewing machine. Alright, now that I have my centerpiece, I'm going to pick another strip of fabric that goes well with that centerpiece, or whatever. And as you can see here, I don't have a strip that is long enough again, so I'm going to go and stitch these two little pieces together on one of the short sides like I did with the first strip. Now I'm going to go to my sewing machine and sew the two strips together with right sides together, and I'm going to sew through the batting as well. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance here. However, you can use a different seam allowance. It's really up to you. It doesn't really matter as long as you sew straight. After you finish sewing the two pieces together, you're going to go to your ironing board and press really well. Easy, right? Now you're going to repeat the same process until you fill up the entire batting. Just as a reminder, if you're using any directional fabric, please make sure that you place it in the direction that you want it to be when it's finished, so that it doesn't go upside down. Next step is quilting. Just a note here, because my fabrics are kind of all over the place, there's no dominant color or there's no coordination whatsoever. I'm going to use white thread so that it blends in with all these colors. I'm going to show you a couple ways that you can quilt this pot holder. The first way is you're going to put your backing fabric wrong side up, followed by your Insul-Bright or Insul fleece or whatever you're using. And then you're going to put your quilt top, which is the piece that we just assembled, on top with right side up. So now you're going to have what's called a quilt sandwich. You can use pins to hold the pieces together, or you can use clips. This quilt sandwich is so small, I'm not going to use anything, and you don't need to trim the fabrics just yet. We're just going to go ahead and quilt first. This is the way I'm going to quilt my pot holder in this video. But before I go to my sewing machine, I would like to show you another way you can quilt your pot holder. So the first way that I mentioned as a traditional way to quilt, you're going to get the same lines on the top of the quilt, on the top of your pot holder, and on the back side of your pot holder. They're going to look the same because you are stitching all layers together at once. Now, let's say you want to spice it up and make a different quilting pattern on the back side of your pot holder. You can definitely quilt the backing fabric to the Insul-Bright separately. Like I'm showing you here, you put the Insul-Bright on the table and then put the backing fabric on top with right side up. And then just go ahead and quilt however you want to do it. And you don't really need to quilt the top since all the strips are stitched down to the batting and they're not going to go anywhere. But you can if you want to. It's kind of fun. Once you've completed all the quilting, you're going to trim the backing fabric and the top to an 8.5 inch square, and then you're going to baste them together with an 1/8 inch seam allowance. So basically you're going to end up with something like a quilt sandwich. I'm going to go with the first method this time, and I'm just going to quilt straight lines along all those strips, about 1/8 of an inch from the edges. For this step, I'm going to use my stitch in the ditch foot, and on my machine, the Toony 6700P, I can attach my stitch in the ditch foot to the walking foot system, which is kind of cool. Okay, so I'm using my stitch in the ditch foot, and I'm going to move my needle so that where I'm stitching is approximately 1/8 of an inch from that seam line where the little guide is. And you will see that I end up stitching much closer to the seam allowance, more like 1/16 of an inch, but that's okay. As long as I get a straight line, I'm fine. You could do a zigzag line, you could do like a wiggly line, you can use a decorative stitch, go crazy with it. And here is my first line. It's very close to the seam allowance, but that's okay. And I'm just going to do the same thing on the entire quilt top. And just in case you were wondering, I'm using a 3mm stitch length here. Here's a teachable moment. Before you start quilting, please make sure you have enough bobbin thread and top thread for that matter, but especially bobbin thread. As you can see here in this situation, I am running out of bobbin thread in the middle of quilting, so I have to wind my bobbin thread and then quilt again, and kind of I get a little icky line, which is a line that is not continuous, which can be an issue if you want to give your quilt away as a gift or if you want to display it. You can unpick that quilting line that you started just to make it neat. I don't care too much about that, so I'm just going to keep quilting. I'm just showing you my quilting lines over here, very quick and simple, and here's how they look on the back side of the potholder. I'm gonna go ahead and trim my quilt sandwich to an 8.5 inch square. You can make this potholder any size you want. You can go bigger, go smaller, totally up to you, but I think this is a good size, so I'm gonna go with that. And I'm gonna start by cutting the quilt sandwich to a 9.5 inch square first, just to make sure that I don't have any corners with no fabric or no quilting lines. And then I'm going to trim that to an 8.5 inch square. Now that I've done that, I'm going to go to my sewing machine and baste the edges of the quilt with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Just in case you were wondering, I'm basting the cut edges to keep everything in place and to keep the strips from unraveling along the edges. This next feature is inspired by Erica from Confessions of a Homeschooler. If you would like to add a tab to your potholder, now is the time to do it. I have already made mine. Here's how it looks. So you're gonna grab your 2 by 6.5 inch strip. Now you're gonna turn it to the wrong side and you're gonna mark 1/4 inch from each of the long edges. Now you don't really need to do this, but I'm really bad at eyeballing. That's why I mark my lines. What you're gonna do is that you're gonna go to your ironing board and then you're gonna press each of the long edges 1/4 inch in, just like what I'm showing you on the screen right now. After you've done that, you're gonna fold the strip towards the middle again, and then you're gonna get a little tube. And it's kind of hard to show you without actually pressing the strip, so I'm gonna go do that real quick. Okay, that's better. Now as you can see, I have folded my long edges 1/4 inch in, and then I folded the piece again. So now I'm ready to sew. I'm gonna go to my sewing machine and then top stitch on the folded edge 1/4 inch from the edge, or an 1/8 of an inch, really up to you. And then I'm also going to top stitch the other long edge. I've done that for this one right here, which I'm going to use for this potholder. Now you're going to decide where you want the tab on the potholder. I like it in the middle, so I'm going to find the middle of the potholder by just folding it in half, easy peasy, and then just clip the middle. And there's a little snip right there in the middle. I'm going to put my tab down and hold each end and then just kind of push both of them towards the middle so that they're not twisted. And then I'm going to lay one end on top of the other and clip the tab on top of my little cut line in the middle of my pot holder. Then I'm going to go to my sewing machine and baste that in place. If you've come this far, good job! Now we're going to attach binding to the pot holder. And like most things in life, there are different ways to attach binding to a quilt, in this case, your pot holder. I like to start from the back side and then flip the binding and finish it on the front. That means I have a stitching line on top of my binding on the front of the pot holder. If you've never done binding before, this is a great project to learn how to do binding on a quilt. To prep your binding, press the binding strip in half lengthwise, wrong sides together. I'm going to flip my pot holder to the back side and I'm going to start from the bottom, somewhere around the middle. I'm going to open up my binding strip and then make a little triangle at one end, just like what you see on the screen. Then I'm going to go to my ironing board and press that triangle and then fold the binding back and just press that middle line again. Once again, I'm going to flip my pot holder to the back side and I'm going to start from the bottom, so the side with no tab. I'm going to open up my binding again and line it up with the edge of the pot holder. And then I'm going to clip the binding to the pot holder. You're only going to clip one edge of the pot holder, so just until you get to the end of that edge. Now I'm going to go to my sewing machine and stitch a 1/4 inch from the edge. And I'm going to start a little bit before the binding and stitch until I get to my marking point where my second clip is. I have my 1/4 inch foot ready. You don't need a 1/4 inch foot, you just need to make sure you're using a 1/4 inch seam allowance here. And I'm just gonna sew right before where my binding starts. Because we're going over a few layers here, I am lengthening my stitch length to 3 millimeters. And I'm using my walking foot here. If you have a walking foot, I highly recommend using it when you're attaching binding to your quilt, or in this case, your pot holder. And I'm just gonna keep sewing until I get to the line that I marked, which is about maybe 3 to 4 inches from where I started sewing. So it's going to look like this. And now I'm going to fold my binding back using the line that I pressed. And then I'm going to go ahead and stitch with all the layers together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to stitch right around where I stopped stitching earlier. So not at the beginning, but a little bit further down. I'm going to keep stitching until I get to a 1/4 inch from the edge of the pot holder. And I have a line on my presser foot to guide me, that line. But if you don't, just make sure that it's a 1/4 inch from the edge. And then you stop. At this stage, I'm going to pivot my pot holder 45 degrees. And I'm going to sew off the pot holder diagonally. I'm making sure that the corner lines up with my line of stitching. And then I just sew off the fabric. So now the stitch line is going to look like that. Next, I'm going to fold the tail of my binding up so that the raw edge lines up with the edge of my pot holder, just like you see here. And now I'm going to grab the tail of my binding and fold it back on the pot holder again. And I make sure that the fold lines up with the edge that I just sewed. So it's going to look like this. While holding that folded edge, I'm pivoting my pot holder to the next side that I'm going to sew. And then I'm going to put my needle down, start sewing, do a little bit of back stitching, and keep sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way till I get to a 1/4 inch from the end of that side. Okay, now that I'm approaching a 1/4 inch from the end, I'm going to stop again and do the same thing, pivot 45 degrees, and then sew off the pot holder. In case you haven't got the hang of it yet, I'm showing you again how I miter the corner, which is what we're doing here. So I'm folding my tail up so that my raw edge of the binding lines up with the next side of my pot holder that I'm about to sew. Then I grab my binding tail again and fold it back on top of the pot holder so that the fold lines up with the side that I just sewed. So now you have a little triangle flap at the corner right there. I'm going to hold that flap and then pivot my fabric 90 degrees and start sewing the next side. And I'm going to miter the other two corners of my pot holder the same way. Now that I'm approaching the side that I started, I'm just going to keep sewing for a little bit. And then I'm going to stop and I'm going to look at my binding tail. And what I want to do is to trim it and tuck the tail under the little pocket that I made at the beginning. So now that I've trimmed my tail, I'm going to just tuck it under that little pocket and make sure it lines up. And I could use my clips to hold it in place. This is one of the easiest ways to cover the raw edges of your binding. Once everything looks nice and neat, I'm going to keep sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance to just finish this side of the binding. I didn't trim the selvage off my binding, so it's peeking out a little bit. Just be careful with that. Now I'm going to go to my ironing board and press the binding so it lies flat. Now that my binding is well pressed, I'm going to turn my pot holder to the front side. And I'm going to fold the edges of my binding over that seam allowance. So I want to make sure that the edges of the binding covers that stitching line. And I'm just going to use my clips to hold the binding in place. At this step, you can go to your ironing board and press the binding to help it lie flat. I think the clips are sufficient. And I'm just going to clip around the pot holder. I'm not going to worry about the corners just yet. I'm going to take care of those in a moment. Right now, I'm just taking care of all the 4 sides of the pot holder. Okay, my binding is clipped in place. Now we're going to go take care of the corners. I'm sure there's a proper way to describe this step, but I'm just going to do it my way, okay? I'm using my fingers to press the binding that's on the horizontal side towards the right side, so I get that little triangle at the end. Then I'm going to pinch that little triangle and then fold it back on the binding so I get that corner. And if it doesn't line up perfectly, don't worry about it. We just want to hold it in place for now. Let's try this once again in slow-mo. So I'm using my fingers to push the horizontal binding to the right side, pinch the triangle, fold it back down, and clip. That's it! When you're sewing over the area where the binding meets, it gets a little thick, and if you use a very small needle, it might break, or you might get skip stitches. So you might want to switch to a larger needle for this part. Time to finish our binding! My favorite presser foot to use for finishing my binding is the Stitch in the Ditch foot because it has a guide and it helps me keep my line straight. I'm going to start from the middle bottom of the pot holder where the binding ends meet. I'm going to line up the edge of my binding with the guide on my presser foot, and then I'm going to move my needle a little bit to the right of the guide, maybe about 1/8 of an inch. I like to stitch pretty close to the edge. One thing I almost forgot to mention is your thread color. Normally you want your thread color to blend in with your binding and also your backing fabric, so you might want to use 2 thread colors, one for the top and one for the bobbin. Don't forget to backstitch at the beginning. Because I'm sewing quite close to the edge, I'm using my stiletto to keep my binding in place. And I'm using a longer stitch length as well. I think I'm using about 3.5 millimeters here. As I'm approaching my first corner, I'm going to remove my clip. I'm going to use my stiletto to help get the fold straight. And I'm using my fingers to try to line up that edge of the triangle with the corner. I'm so sorry that my hand's in the way, but you'll see better in a minute. Alright, so that's the best I could get for that one. And I'm just going to keep holding it with my stiletto. So if you have a pin or even a pencil, you could use that as well. As you can see here, I'm sewing very slowly and I keep adjusting if I need to. So really take your time here. Once I catch the fold with my stitch, I'm just gonna stop. I don't want to sew too far in. If you need to, use your hand wheel to adjust your stitch length. Then I'm going to pivot and continue sewing and make sure that the folded edge of my binding lines up with the guide on my presser foot. And because the corners tend to be a little more bulky, sometimes I use my hand wheel to get started and then I just keep sewing. I'm going to show you one more time how to get the corner to look neat, as best as you can, of course. So I hold my stiletto along the edge of my pot holder like that while I'm trying to get the corners to match. And I just use the stiletto to hold the corner in place as I keep sewing. Back to the side I started on, so I'm just gonna keep sewing, and then once I get to where I started, I'm going to backstitch and cut my threads. Binding was not so bad, right? Even though I don't get perfect corners, I'm totally okay with that. Alternatively, you can finish your binding by hand. I will link to a video tutorial for sewing binding by hand in the description box. This last step is completely optional, but I think it takes the potholder to the next level. I'm going to sew the button on top of the tab to keep it upright. I'm going to use my sewing machine to sew this button on. I'll link to Minky Kim's video if you'd like to see how to sew the button on by hand. And also, I got this idea from that video, so thank you, Minky Kim! Now I'm going to go to my sewing machine and show you how I sew this button on the potholder. I highly recommend using the button sewing presser foot for this step. If you don't have this foot, I would highly suggest sewing the button on by hand. The button sewing foot has this blue thingy that is kind of rubbery, so it's going to help prevent your button from moving around, which can cause your needle to break. I have my button sewing foot ready to go. Now I'm going to go to my zigzag stitch, change the stitch length to 0. Because we don't want the needle to move forward at all. And then adjust my stitch width to the distance between the two holes on my button, which is 4 millimeters. You need to be really precise with the width because you don't want the needle to land on the button and not in the hole. So measure carefully. Another thing that you can do is lower the feed dog. My machine doesn't let me sew with the feed dog down in this stitch option, so I just leave it up and it's fine. Also, it would make your life easier if you tape your button onto the tab. Use some sort of clear tape so that it doesn't move around. I don't have tape on hand, so I'm just gonna make it work. Now I am making sure that the left hole of my button lines up with the needle position and that my button is straight. I'm going to use my sewing machine to tie a knot at the beginning, and after that, once it goes to zigzag mode, I'm going to use my hand wheel all the way because I don't want to risk breaking my needle. If you're still confused about how to sew a button on a sewing machine, I will link to a video that I find helpful in the description box. Okay, I just saw my machine starting the zigzag stitch. Now I'm going to switch to my hand wheel and stitch back and forth about 20 times. And this is just my preference. You can do it until it looks secure to you. And once I'm done, I'm going to hit the knot button again, and my machine is going to tie another knot to secure my stitch in place. Then I'm going to lift my presser foot up and then cut my thread. And now your Scrappy pot holder is complete. I hope you like yours. Mine is very random, just like me. And now I'm going to show you the back. Nothing much. I hope you've had fun making a Scrappy pot holder with me. As always, thank you for watching, happy holidays, and see you in the next video. Bye!